Right guys, welcome to this brief video on the idiographic and nomothetic approaches in psychology. Over the next 15 minutes or so, we're going to cover everything that you can see on the screen now. This is everything that you're going to need to know to understand the debate and to answer any questions that might come up in the exam. If you want to skip to any of these sections, then you can use the timings in the description below to do that. This is a video lesson rather than a practice video, so if you're interested in some exam practice, there are links in the description below that will take you to some example essays and past paper questions. And quickly, just before we start, if you find this video useful, a like would be amazing. So the idiographic nomothetic debate focuses on the question of whether psychological research should focus on the creation of universal laws that apply to the majority of people, or should psychology focus on unique individual experiences? The idiographic approach focuses on trying to understand individuals as unique beings, and to do that it looks at specific characteristics, experiences, and traits that make each person different from others. And psychologists who take this approach have no intention of formulating general laws of behavior or comparing results to others. The focus in the idiographic approach is very much on the individual and understanding what makes a particular person who they are. The nomothetic approach, on the other hand, aims to establish general laws or to find patterns of behavior that apply to everyone. Instead of focusing on individual differences, psychologists following a nomothetic approach are interested in finding common traits and behaviors that can be applied to a larger group of people. And they achieve that by studying large groups of people in order to provide norms against which people can be compared, classified, and measured. Now, the approach that a psychologist takes has implications for the types of research methods they choose to use, because studying individuals in depth requires a different set of tools to studying larger groups and discussing commonalities. So in this section of the video, we're going to have a look at what types of methods are generally associated with each approach. So idiographic research tends to favor qualitative methods, which makes sense because the aim is to gain an in-depth understanding of individual experiences. So for example, researchers may base their research on first-hand accounts from a small number of people, or even individuals. They might also use unstructured interviews to be able to gain rich insight on a particular element of human behavior. The data that they gather can then be analysed using something like a thematic analysis. Now, it's important to note here as well that even though the goal isn't to produce general laws of behaviour, the conclusions that are drawn might help other people that are going through similar experiences, or they might, for example, help mental health professionals determine best practice for a particular disorder. Now, nomothetic research, on the other hand, fits closely with the traditional models of the scientific method in psychology. So researchers taking a nomothetic approach are likely to formulate hypotheses. They're going to assess large samples of participants using methods that produce quantitative data. So that might be through a psychometric test, like an IQ test, or through questionnaires. The data that's produced is going to be numerical, and then it's analysed using techniques like correlations, descriptive statistics, and inferential statistics. So that means that nomothetic methods allow researchers to quantify and compare human behavior so that generalizations can be made and universal laws of behavior can be produced. So we're now going to look at some examples of both nomothetic and idiographic approaches used in psychology. I've got a couple for each just because it's important to be able to use those examples and imagine how each of these approaches could be used in research, especially if you get an application question or an essay. So let's start with the idiographic approach, and this is a nice straightforward example of the humanistic approach. Remember what you know about the humanistic approach. It rejects scientific methods and it views each individual as unique. That being the case, it wouldn't be interested in generating universal laws. In terms of the methods, Rogers tried to explain the process of personal growth and the importance of unconditional positive regard through in-depth conversations with clients in therapy. Okay, he didn't do it though by having huge amounts of participants and then kind of averaging out their results. Sticking with the approaches, the psychodynamic approach also used idiographic methods because Freud conducted very detailed investigations into the lives of his patients in an attempt to understand and help them overcome their psychological disorders. Okay, so Freud very much used case studies, and you can name some if you want. He had Anna O, he had Little Hans. These are case studies that you might have come across when you covered the psychodynamic approach. Now, at this point, I will just point out that the psychodynamic approach sits on the fence a little bit because Freud used idiographic methods like case studies, like I just said, but then he went on to create universal theories like the psychosexual stages or the structure of personality based on his findings from those couple of case studies that he conducted. So if you're going to use the psychodynamic approach as an example for the idiographic approach, just make sure you're being clear that his methods were idiographic, even though he then used them for nomothetic purposes. Now, if we get a little bit more specific, an idiographic approach to researching something like depression could also be used, and it would be based on a variety of different methods. So, for example, it might involve first-hand accounts from a small number of people, followed by in-depth interviews focusing on a particular area related to depression, like motivation levels. Then to finish off, those accounts or those interviews might be analysed for themes using a content analysis or a thematic analysis. Okay, so moving on then, we have the nomothetic approach, and you'll find that most of the approaches that we cover in the curriculum prefer to take a nomothetic approach because it's more scientific. So in the behaviourist approach, Skinner studied hundreds of rats and pigeons and cats to develop operant conditioning, which is a general law of learning that has been applied universally to humans and animals alike. Similarly, the biological approach has conducted countless brain scans on humans, which has resulted in the increased understanding of concepts like localization of function, which is a universal theory of the brain. Again, getting a little bit more specific, biological psychologists take a nomothetic approach when trying to explain psychological disorders, such as OCD and depression. So, for example, research with large groups of people have identified specific neurotransmitters implicated in the disorders, such as low levels of serotonin. And research like that has then, of course, led to the development of treatments such as antidepressants and SSRIs that are used to treat large groups of people. Okay, and then just to finish off this little section on examples, I think it's important to understand that whilst approaches and researchers will generally be in favour of using either idiographic or nomothetic methods, there are some that use both. So if you take the cognitive approach, for example, it tries to create general laws of memory, like we just saw with the multi-store model or the working memory model, and it does that using experiments conducted on large groups of people. However, equally, it uses case studies to investigate rare memory conditions, and then those case studies are often used to refute or support the models that have been produced. Okay, so there are cases where there is crossover between the two. Now, I know that I've given you a lot of examples here, but it's important that you always have an example on hand to illustrate a particular issue and debate that you are discussing. Okay, so even if you just reach back to your favorite approach and you can use that approach to talk about nomothetic methods or idiographic methods, even if you just have one, that's fine, but you just have to bear in mind that questions in exams very often ask you to refer to topics that you've covered in the curriculum in your answer. And also, it's definitely easier to describe a particular concept if you've got an example that you can refer back to that will help you to illustrate the point that you're trying to make. Okay, we're now going to have a quick look at the evaluation points. I've got 3 for you because I think 3 is enough. I've got a strength of the idiographic approach, I've got a strength of the nomothetic approach with a counterpoint, and then there is a discussion point that suggests that both of the approaches should come together and be complementary rather than contradictory. Okay, so that should be enough for any essay that you have to write, but obviously bear in mind as well that very often the strength of one approach is a flipped limitation of the other approach. Okay, so we're going to start off with a strength of the idiographic approach, and that is that it brings the focus back onto the individual. Lots of psychologists in the latter half of the last century have felt that there's been too much emphasis on measurement and that psychologists have lost sight what it actually means to be human. And that was argued by Allport, who suggested that it's only by knowing the person that we can actually predict what that person is going to do in any situation. So, for example, Milgram's research found that 65% of participants obeyed an authority figure and inflicted a 450-volt electric shock because they were ordered to do so. However, the results failed to provide an explanation of why each person obeyed, and there may have been very different circumstances that led to the obedience found in each participant. Equally, research into schizophrenia can tell us that there's a 1% lifetime risk of developing schizophrenia. However, that tells us very little about what life is like for somebody who has schizophrenia. Therefore, a huge strength of the idiographic approach has been to focus psychology back on the more individual, personal level and to bring the person back into psychology. So moving on, we now have a strength of the nomothetic approach, and due to the nomothetic approach being considered more scientific, it's useful for controlling and predicting behavior, which in turn can be useful for things like producing drugs to treat mental illness. So for example, biological psychologists take a nomothetic approach when explaining OCD and claim that OCD is caused by low levels of serotonin. Drug therapies are developed on the basis of nomothetic research and work by increasing the availability and the uptake of serotonin, thus reducing the anxiety associated with OCD, which helps to improve the lives of people suffering with this condition. Now, that's not possible in an idiographic approach because it would be far too time-consuming to produce personal therapies for unique individuals. However, just as a little counterpoint to that, you have to bear in mind that not all drug treatments are successful for all patients. And some psychologists argue that alternative treatments, like cognitive behavior therapy, which are based on an idiographic approach, are more suitable for treating individuals with conditions like OCD, depression, anxiety disorder, and so on, because they try to understand and explain the disorder from a patient's point of view, and then take an individual approach to tackling the patient's experiences. Okay? And then, finally, we have a bit of a point that brings both together, okay? And that is the goal of modern psychology is to provide rich, detailed descriptions of human behavior as well as the explanation of such behavior within the framework of general laws, okay? Now, bearing that in mind, it might be more useful, depending on the issue at hand, to view the approaches as being complementary rather than mutually exclusive. Okay, so research on memory, for example, as we talked about earlier, attempts to establish general laws, but case studies of atypical behavior, such as patient KF, demonstrated that these theories were overly simplistic. Okay, so idiographic research showed that there was more to short-term memory that was initially theorized, and so more comprehensive models were able to be put forward, such as the working memory model, which has in turn increased our understanding of how memory works. Therefore, seeing the two approaches as complementary rather than contradictory would be more in line with the goals of psychology because it would lead to a greater understanding of human behavior. Okay, those were your evaluation points. Just to finish off, I'm going to very quickly flick through each one of those points written out as a full Peel paragraph just so that you could see how they would be formulated. Okay? And that brings us to the end of the video. There's been a lot of content to cover, but I hope it's been useful and I hope it's all made sense. Please let me know by hitting the like button. If you have any questions, please pop them in the comment section below and I will do my best to get back to you ASAP. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next one.